So the first thing I'd like to do is give a bit of a tour of the hospital. These slides, I should say, were taken in 2017 during the winter, but I think they're still pretty good. The hospital hasn't changed that much. So the first slide is a front view of the hospital from Dunedin Street, and you can see the drive up to the front door and the cenotaph, and you can see part of the Soldiers Wing, part of the Harvey Wing, and also at the back is the new community tower. This is a picture taken now from Colburn Street, and it shows again the Soldiers Wing and then the community tower, which was erected in 2006, which is the tall part at the back. This is a picture now from where the cenotaph is, and it shows the Soldiers Wing, which is still the medical ward for the hospital. And moving on now, this is the Eleanor Johnson nursing residence. It was a nursing residence for many years until the school was discontinued in 1974. It's now administration and mental health. Next is the Princess Elizabeth Wing. This faces out on Dunedin Street. It's a small, uninspiring red brick building, and it still has pediatrics and some maternity in there as well. Then there is this small brick building as well, built in the 1950s, which is the old nursing residence that's now become administration. And then finally we see the very lovely community tower, which opened in 2006 and has a number of, has the surgical wards and the ORs and endoscopy and other services such as that. I should also include in this tour 16 O'Brien Street, which is across the street. It's a medical building and has been since about 1970. The reason is that this used to be the site of the original nurses' residence, which was right across the street from the hospital on Mississauga Street. But it is now the O'Brien Street medical building. The first hospital to be built in Orillia was actually back in 1889, and that's quite a long time ago. In fact, what it was prior to socialized medicine or socialized health care, and there was a businessman by the name of J.P. Secord, and he was a real estate man in Orillia, a financial guy and a businessman, and he decided that he was going to build a Red Cross hospital with the plan to sell shares in the hospital for $5 a year. This is 1889. One could get your medical care for that amount of money. And so patients put up this $5 certificate for which they would get their so-called free health care. It sounds very much like the US system today. The doctors at the time thought it was a great idea, and they all bought into it. And they thought the location was excellent because it was right on at the Narrows of the hospital of Orillia, I think on Lake Simcoe to be exact, and they were happy that the cool breezes from the lake would be able to flow through the building, and there'd be lots of ozone in the air that would help with healing patients no matter what their disease was. It opened to great fanfare in November of 1889, and it was open for a number of years, but it really did not catch on. And the reason is that $5 in 1889 was quite a lot of money, and in those days people really did not trust hospitals that much. Hospitals were places where the indigent went and poor people went to die and this kind of thing. The fact of the matter is that most health care took place at home. It didn't take place in hospitals or medical centers. And so, for example, if you had an appendectomy, it was done at home. It wasn't done in the hospital. It had 47 beds, and at least one operation was carried out there, but not much more. So it closed actually about 3 years later. And interestingly, it is arguably that it may have been the first public health facility in all of Canada. It was really ahead of its time in many ways, and it would be another 40 years before any sort of public health system was developed. So Orillia may have been a leader in that it was the first hospital to have sort of a public health system. The hospital became the Orchard Point Inn and a summertime place, and unfortunately it burned down in 1956. So that was the turn of the century, and of course one has to ask, well, what was the health like at the turn of the 20th century? This is before the Orillia Hospital, any Orillia hospitals came about, and to be honest, health at that time was not that good. There were serious public health issues, sanitation, garbage, infection. There was nothing like penicillin or antibiotics, not until the 1940s. There was no IV therapy. IV normal saline, which is the main solution used today, was not discovered until 1900. Even Sir John A. Macdonald, when he was the Prime Minister, he developed gallbladder disease sometime in the 1870s. And he didn't go to a hospital for treatment of that. He went actually to his office in the Parliament buildings. And that's where they kept him until he got better. And fortunately, he got better without an operation. General anesthetic was just coming in. There was chloroform and open drop ether, and it was quite risky, not the way it is today. There were boards of health, but they didn't really have anything to do with the running or administration of hospitals. And so it wasn't until the 1940s that you got federal grants for health, and it wasn't until 1965 that we saw the first insurance plan, what was called OMSIP at that time. And that was the beginning of it, and many who are listening to this talk probably remember those days. Now, what was health like in Orillia? This is a letter I would like to read. It was an article, actually, written in 1905. And it made it into the Orillia Times, which was the paper that preceded the packet. And so I'm just going to read about 4 or 5 lines to just give you an idea of what it was like and what people were facing in those times. November 2nd, 1905. There have been several cases of typhoid fever in Orillia this year, a disease which experts say is impossible to exist in a community hospital where the drinking water is pure and sewage is properly disposed of. Orillia is fortunate in the first of these conditions, having a good supply of pure spring water, but fails lamentably in regard to the latter. Sewage is deposited anywhere out of sight, and that is the most that can be said. A hot summer would probably cause an epidemic, and in such an event, the money spent could build sewers twice over. Orillia needs sewers more than it needs good roads. Orillia needs sewers more than it needs new industries, and so forth. So that gives you a bit of a picture. And it was expensive. Healthcare was expensive in those days, 1892. And here's a bill from a Dr. McConnell and Brown. I guess they shared a practice, to a William Morris. And the bill was for $24, which was an outstanding amount of money in 1892. I have no idea what this poor Mr. Morris had done or what happened to him, but that was a lot of money in 1892. Now, we're now moving ahead now to 1902, and there was some energy developing within the town to build a hospital. And in fact, it probably was from the women of the town who decided that a hospital was needed. And so a number of the leading women of Orillia put together a committee to look at the possibility of building a hospital in the Orillia area or something of that nature. And so again, I'm just going to read a letter from the Weekly Times, and it was an assembly for the hospital fund. So in other words, this was probably the first fundraising for a hospital, and it's dated November 13th, 1902. Assemble for hospital fund. With commendable energy, the committee of ladies composing the provisional board of the proposed Orillia Hospital have arranged for an assembly to be held on Thursday evening, the 27th. A spacious dining floor in the Tudhope Carriage Company's new building, now nearing completion, has been secured. And the music will be furnished by Gliana's Orchestra of Toronto. Needless to say, this will be the event of the season. And that's 1902. And so they were off the mark there. And so time went by, and 5 years later, they apparently had raised enough money to purchase some property. And so in 1907, again in the Orillia Times, we have a small article about the fact that the Dunn property in Orillia had been bought or purchased for the site of the new hospital. And that is still the site of where the hospital is today. So again, let me just read a few lines from the original article in the paper. At a general meeting of the hospital board on Tuesday, it was decided to purchase as a site the John Dunn property on Mississauga Street West. The property consists of 2 1/4 acres and has a large frontage on both Mississauga and Frederick Street. The land is high and dry and has natural drainage. A small creek crossing the lower corner of the lot is there. There is on the property a 10-roomed brick-clad dwelling, and whether this structure will be utilized as part of the new building has not been decided. The purchase price is $3,500, and $800 has been offered for the building as it stands, which, if sold, will reduce the price of the lot to $2,700. And so, as it turns out, that was indeed what they bought, and that building became the first hospital in Orillia. Now, we moved on to a black and white slide, and it shows a picture of the original SMH property, about 1900. And it's hard for me to tell, but I think the picture is taken from Mississauga Street, Mississauga Street. You can see some boys playing, and I think they're playing cricket on this vacant lot, and that is where the first hospital was built. I do not see the 10-room house, but it's hard to know where it is, but my impression is that it's from Mississauga Street, or pardon me, from Colburn Street. Okay, now I'm looking at a map, and it's a map that is of the Mount Slavin property, which is really the property that goes from West Mount Street east, all the way east, sort of along the north side of Mississauga Street. And one can see on this property, I put an arrow which gives the approximate location of the hospital. It's a blue arrow on the left side. And you can see Mississauga Street. And you can see a small creek that is running across it. Now, it's interesting, too, that this property really was holy ground, meaning that it was a burial site for the natives that had lived in the area, the Chippewa. And so it is somewhat interesting, maybe disturbing, that some of the hospital may have been built over native burial grounds. But be that as it may, the hospital did initially have a small creek running through it. And so when I was making this talk, putting it together in January 27th, it was a very snowy winter there in that time. And this slide shows just to the other side, the north side of Mississauga Street. And if you climb over the snowbanks, you can see that there's a little bridge which crosses Mount Slaveman Creek in the winter. And that creek is still there. And looking now at another photo, you can see there's a little creek that is the creek in the summer. It's not very, it's pretty dry at that time of year, but it still does exist. And it's just off of the small parking lot that is right across from the old emergency department of the hospital. Finally though, May 28th, 1908, the opening of the Orillia General Hospital took place. And again, I'm just going to read a little bit on that topic from the Weekly Times. The formal opening of the Orillia General Hospital will take place at 2:30 o'clock this afternoon. Among those who will assist in the ceremony are the resident clergy, President Shepherd, and Dr. Bruce Smith of Toronto. A public reception will be held both afternoon and evening. So that was the beginning of the Orillia General Hospital. And here's a picture of it. It is the first, it's called the Dunn Residence. And this is a black and white picture of the building. And in addition, there's an additional slide that is a postcard that you could have bought in the hospital showing the original hospital. Now, why you would send a postcard from the hospital, I don't know, but they did have postcards from the hospital, and it was a fairly attractive looking building. The fact of the matter is that some of the older doctors in town still, for example, Dr. Harry Hall, and I think even Dr. Bill Zufeld, they worked in this building, what became the Queen Mary building. And if you look at this photo, there's an arrow pointing to Dunedin Street. So people entered to the hospital from Dunedin Street. Now this is an air view. I don't know if it's a drone, I don't think so, but a view of the hospital from really must be the 1980s. And again, the blue arrow gives you the site of where the original hospital was. It was renamed the Queen Mary Hospital once the original Soldiers Memorial was built. And you can see, of course, its relationship to the Soldiers Wing, and you can see its relationship to the Harvey Wing. But unfortunately, the Queen Mary, the big house, was taken down when they built the Harvey Wing. And it's in the, as you can see, it's in the southwest corner. This is what a hospital would look like in the early 20th century. Large wards with multiple beds, and if you think about it, infection control really wasn't, you know, that strict. If you can imagine being in a hospital like this, and the patient would be in the bed beside you, maybe vomiting or, you know, bringing out blood or whatever it is. So they were quite different places than what we have now. In fact, I think most hospitals, if they're built these days, the best ones have private rooms for all patients, private rooms. This is an OR in the early 20th century. It doesn't look that much different than what we have today. Some of the equipment is a little more sophisticated, but it is more or less the same. You have a surgeon, you have an assistant, you have a scrub nurse and a circulating nurse, and you have an anesthetist, of course. There's a patient from 1908. It's obviously winter time, and I'm not sure what her problem was, but there's a nurse holding or helping a patient that's been in the hospital. Now, I would be remiss if I did not mention Eleanor Johnson and the nursing school. So the nursing school was an integral part of the original Orillia Soldiers Hospital, And the first intake of students was at the same time that the hospital opened in 1908. And so this is a picture from 1910, the first graduates of the nursing school, and they're sitting with Eleanor Johnson. Eleanor Johnson carried on the school for many years, and in fact was very involved with the hospital in an administrative level until she retired. But the nursing school was very much an important part of the picture of Orillia Soldiers Hospital. It existed for 64 years, actually, and it graduated 700 nurses, and it was absorbed by Georgian College in 1974 when community colleges took over the training of nurses at that time. Now, of course, what happens is that when a hospital gets built, people come to it, and eventually it gets overtaxed, overcrowded, not enough equipment, not enough beds, and that kind of thing. And so by 1911, only 3 years after it had opened, the Orillia Hospital was in that state. It was overcrowded, and I will read just a couple of lines again from this paper. The Orillia Hospital Board is considering the question of enlarging the building as the present accommodation is totally inadequate. A public meeting was held last Friday when the letter which follows was read. And they go on to talk about needing more space for the hospital. And so, and it hasn't changed much even, over 100 years later. Of course, what made things a lot worse was that it was, the First World War came along, and that brought veterans home after the war was over, and these, of course, were injured men and women, many of them malnourished, and then on top of that, by 1918, you had the Spanish flu. We're in the midst of the COVID epidemic at the present time, and the Spanish flu killed approximately 20 million people around the world. So that, of course, would have caused a huge influx of patients. And so they decided they needed to have a new hospital. And so they again put together a funding, at least a foundation, and began to collect funds. And I'd like to read again a letter that sort of goes on about the contract to build the first OSMH, Orillia Soldiers Hospital. And it sounds so much like today. It's just incredible, because it's just like you might see in a newspaper or a letter from an administrator today. So I'm going to read this. It's from August of 1921. After much negotiation and numerous vexatious delays from various causes, the contract for the Orillia Soldiers Memorial Hospital was let on Tuesday to E. Webb and Son, Orillia. Messrs. Webb have undertaken the work on a percentage basis, and with the guarantee that the entire new building shall not cost more than $110,000. The agreement with the board is a very favorable one. The board, through its building committee, have absolute control of the purchase of materials and will pay all bills, including labor. So that was the beginning of the building. But I love that first line about vexatious delays, because that is so in keeping with which we still hear today. All right, so now we're at a slide that shows the laying of the cornerstone of the hospital in September of 1921. And you can see that actually the cornerstone was laid well after they'd started to put the hospital up. And there's a number of men on the podium. And the fellow talking is a fellow by the name of D.C. Anderson. And so D.C. Anderson, the guy at the podium, was the chair of the hospital board. Now, I've put a blue arrow over the top of one man, and to my way of thinking, if you look closely at him, I think Stephen Leacock is on the podium as well. And you can look on the ground, you can see a number of World War I veterans standing in the audience, and a number of nurses. So it must have been quite a ceremonial day that they had there. That was September of 1921. Now, people wonder, where did the name Soldiers Memorial Hospital came from? And it was Charles Harold Hale who instigated that. And so he was one of the original city fathers. I think he was the mayor at one time. And he was instrumental he was on the building committee and was very instrumental in getting things going. And it was his idea to make the hospital a tribute to the World War I soldiers. And so it became Soldiers Memorial Hospital, or Orillia Soldiers Memorial Hospital, OSMH. It finally opened in 1922, and after it was built, and there was a number of dignitaries there. And you can see a picture from the paper which shows the Bings. Now, Lord Byng was the Governor General. So the Governor General of Canada came from Ottawa by train to Orillia to open the hospital. You can of course see W.H. Tudhope, he was the mayor at the time, and also Elsie Johnson is in the picture, and this D.C. Anderson as well. And it was a great affair. And here, of course, is more of a close-up of the Bings. You have Lady Byng on the left and Baron Byng on the right. Baron Byng of Vimy, to be exact, the Governor General of Canada. And here's a picture of the original hospital from 1922. You can notice there's a Ford Model T out in the driveway. And if you look over on the left, the far left, you can see the old Queen Mary building, or what was the original house that the hospital was on. This hospital, you entered the driveway on Colburn Street, and it looks like there was a drive going up to Dunedin Street as well. But that was the hospital for until I think 1979, until the Soldiers Wing was built. Now we're seeing a picture of the east end of the hospital. That's the men's ward, and it's a multiple bed ward. Nice big windows seem to be important to people in those days. And it was an interesting place. Many of the doctors that are still alive, Dr. Jeffries, for example, Dr. Hall, a number of these older doctors certainly worked a good number of hours in this hospital. This is a picture of the pediatric ward beyond, and you can see a number of nurses sitting at a small nursing station in that the interior of the hospital. Unfortunately, I don't have any pictures of the ORs or anything like that. So here's a picture of the hospital from 1923, and then one in 1979, shortly before it was torn down. What I would point out to you is on the far right, there's a very large fir tree, and you can see it quite easily in 1979. But then if you look closely, 1923, you can see it's just a very small tree. So in literally, what is that, 56 years, the tree has grown enormous, and so it's quite an interesting view. I should remind everyone that there are some memorial plaques in the chapel of the current hospital, of our hospital, that memorialize the fallen people from the Orillia area that fell in World War I, and also from World War II. Now, things carried on fine until the 1940s, and then after the Second World War was over, they were concerned again about building up the hospital, because it was the number of patients was beginning to take its toll on the building and the staff. And there's some interesting statistics about that. For example, number of outpatients in 1939 was 89, And then in 1946, 1,084. So that's a big difference in a matter of 7 years. And so they decided they needed to build more as well. And so they raised money, and the new Princess Elizabeth Wing was open in August of 1952. And it's a fairly uninspiring looking building by today's standards. It was a red brick building, very functional. And you can see that it is there with sitting right beside the Queen Mary part. And it became actually maternity. It was a maternity ward at the time that it opened. And again, it was all opening on Dunedin Street. And interestingly, there was no emergency department when it was first built. There was no ICU. 1952, there was only the idea of ICUs was just still a little bit in the future. And there was no emerge. There was a room that someone could go and see a doctor in the evening, but nobody, and you had to call the doctor in from his home to go and see him. This is the opening of the Princess Elizabeth Wing. Of course, we all know who Princess Elizabeth is now. She's been the Queen since about 1952, or 53, I think it is. And so it is the Princess Elizabeth Wing, which is still in existence today and still serving the community as the pediatric inpatient ward. There's a picture of it now with the other parts of the hospital. Next building was 1957. They decided to build a new nursing residence. And again, somewhat uninspiring architecture, but it was a separate building. Was not attached to the hospital at all. And in fact, if you look at this photo, here's a photo from 1957. You can see some young nurses that are walking from the residence across a path, and they've crossed a little bridge. And that bridge is the creek that we had talked about earlier. That's the Slavin Creek. And some people call it Vin's Creek as well. But that came down Mount Slavin. And if you, the nurses are walking towards the hospital, the one that opened in 1922. And carrying on then, this is an air view of the hospital in the 1960s. And I should point out that is the old hospital. And you can see in the far right, the brick building that was the nurses' residence. And you can also see that once they built the Harvey Wing, they closed over the creek. So the creek is no longer there. It was obviously put into some big pipes buried underneath the ground. And you can see, though, that the nurses had to walk from the nurses' residence over to the original hospital. I'd also point out the West Ward School playground, which I will get to in a minute. So they decided to add on, and of course that meant that the Queen Mary building had to be torn down. And in the 1960s, that was done, and they then went and built the Harvey Wing, 1963. And we can see just an interior picture of some of the beds that were spanking new. The cost of the Harvey Wing was just over $2 million, $2,227,000. And it had a cafeteria, it had the kitchen, I should say. It had the X-ray department and so forth. And so it was a well-needed addition. We can see some of the dignitaries here in this opening. You have Bill Hume, the CEO, and you can see the fellow that's I think his name is Nelson, who was the head of the district health area. You can see Bernard Jones, who was another nurse that was very prominent for 40 years in the hospital. And also the mayor of Orillia, a female, whose name I do not remember. And then we have Glenn Phelps, who was the chair of the board. there's the opening of the 1963 wing, and again, it's on Dunedin Street. And the entrance now that was built for is now the entrance to dialysis. So it's at what you might call the back of the hospital. It's where the dialysis patients come in now. And that was the main entrance to the hospital in those days, 1963. There's a picture of it again, 1963. You can see that, and the Elizabeth wing as well. All right, so then by 1965, they knew they needed a new nursing residence, or more of one. They decided to build a brand new nursing residence, and there's a good picture here of Glenn Phelps looking at the plans with some of the people of the board. And finally, that went under construction, and we have a view now of the nursing residence, and it was aptly named the Elsie Johnson Residence, taking place. It really had two parts. It had one part that connected the original nursing residence to the rest of the hospital, to the Harvey wing, and then also there was the portion that is on Mississauga Street that's still in existence today. So we're moving on now to slide 63, and you can see this part of the Eleanor Johnson residence, which if you live in Orillia is a very familiar part. You drive by it all the time on Mississauga Street, and I think, you know, architecturally it's quite attractive. It's not bad for something built in the 1960s. It is now administration, of course, and I think there's some mental health services in it as well. All right, so now I'm showing an aerial view again, and on this, in the bottom right, you can see what's called the site of the West Ward School. And this is a sort of a map, I suppose, of the hospital, and you can see the hospital, you can see Colburn Street, you can see Dunlop Street and Mississauga Street West, and the site of the West Ward School. And there was a fire at the West Ward School in 1968, and truthfully, it probably was the best thing that ever happened to Orillia Soldiers Memorial Hospital. And of course, we can see a slide here where the firemen are, putting water to the thing to try to save it. But alas, on the next slide, you can see that it's pretty well collapsed in rubble. And lo and behold, the hospital had room for a parking lot. And that was, I think there were probably quite a few people in that day, 1968, that were smiling the day after that fire because now their dreams had come true and they were able to continue with expansion of the hospital and actually provide more parking, which was, I think, desperately needed. Still is. So that was made into a parking lot. By 1979, there again was a need for upgrading. And remember, the original hospital, built in 1922, was still there, was still being used. And so in 1979, funding was started up again. And the county pledged $1 million, and they got money from the ministry as well. And so they were able to go ahead and, after raising money, an $8 million expansion was approved. And that was in May of 1979 that it was approved. And you can see a number of people, very enthusiastic doctors that are involved. The fellow that is standing in the front is a very young looking Dr. Cy Lowry, who is just in the process of retiring. And there also is flanking him is on the right is Dr. Carl Hiltz, who was a radiologist here for many years. And then to his left is Dr. John Mueller, who both Dr. Hiltz and Dr. Mueller have passed away. But Dr. Lowry is coming up to his, let's see, I think his 67th birthday. So he's still around. He was much younger then. And it was opened to great fanfare, it had great technology, it had a nice ICU, which I worked in and spent many, many hours working in the ICU there, in the soldiers' wing. And this is a picture of the opening of that soldiers' wing. You can see Al McLean, he is was the MP at the time. And you see Doug Lewis as well, who was a minister in Mulroney's cabinet, and then another unidentified gentleman giving a speech. And that talk took place in the lobby of the current current hospital that we're in right now. We can also see over in the corner Bob Kehoe. So that's the hospital. Now we're on slide 73, which shows the hospital from 1982 to 2006. Pretty much this stayed the same. You have the soldiers' wing, you have the nurses' residence, you have the Harvey wing, and you have Elizabeth wing as well. And then times got tougher. I mean, once the 80s came, in the 90s, money was tight, and so there really wasn't much going on. Tough times, ministry was cutting back, and it was a bit of a difficult time for all hospitals in Ontario. Still is, as you all know, when it comes to healthcare. There was hospitals in the red, money woes, and so it was a tough time. However, not all was bad for SMH. They entered a competition in 1997 and became the top institution for the National Quality Institute. They were the tops in Canada, and that took place at the Royal York Hotel in Toronto. And you can see this picture with the headline from the Orillia packet called SMH Tops in Canada, and that was a great achievement for them. I'm not in that photo, unfortunately, but probably in the OR. And so they continued to campaign, and more campaigning was done because they needed more modernization. And so the community tower was finally approved and was under construction in 2004, 2005, and was built, and there it is, opened in 2006. And that's the completion of the various towers. Now, I wanted to point out this. This is a kind of a mathematical sine wave, and I thought that it demonstrated very well kind of what happens to a hospital over time, and you build something and you need money, you build and then you go into debt, and then you raise funds, and then you're in deficit, then you raise funds, and then you get that money and you build more. So it's kind of an up and down thing, like a sine wave that kind of characterizes, no doubt, building of not just hospitals, but many public institutions, I'm sure. There was a big crisis in 2007. I wasn't here at that time. I moved to Thunder Bay for a number of years to work there, and there was a crisis that involved the CEO of the hospital, and I won't get into the details of that, but it was a tough time, I think, within the walls of the hospital itself. It wasn't all just about building. There were some issues, and eventually that CEO moved on, and things settled down again. You can see Dr. Toy, was the plastic surgeon, the short guy on the right, yelling at somebody at one of the board meetings, and so that's an interesting shot. He's a good friend of mine, and I can see him doing that. So I guess what I would like to say about that time is overcoming adversity really is part of every hospital's DNA, because it isn't tough being in the healthcare sector. And I've got on this slide, it says, overcoming adversity, old soldiers never die, they just battle on. And I think that's true the current time. I think the future is looking at building a brand new hospital, and good luck to them on that, and I hope they'll be able to do it. I'd like to show just a few pictures of some people that were important to the The Orillia Hospital, I would start off with the Harveys of Orillia. There's actually a book written about the Harveys. As you know, we have had the Harvey wing, and I think there's a Harvey Road in Orillia here. And they were farmers in the area. This is John, the patriarch. He was born in 1788, and he immigrated in 1832 and died in 1861. And he came to this area. He was the first Harvey, came from Scotland. This is his son, old Charles Harvey. He was the father of 3 doctors, 2 MDs and a dentist. And on the next slide, I put an arrow by Dr. J.N. Harvey and Dr. A.R. Harvey. And so Dr. A.R. Harvey, the one in the front row, is the doc that became the Harvey Clinic. So a number of you may remember that. There was the Reiner Clinic and the Harvey Clinic for many years, early in time, 50s and 60s. And so A.R. Harvey became the Harvey Clinic. J.N. Harvey, I presume, was part of the Harvey Clinic. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture later of Dr. A.R. Harvey, but I do have a picture of J.N. Harvey, and that's him in in the 1940s, Dr. James Norman Harvey. And that's the Harvey Clinic. Today it is still a law office at the corner of Peter and Colburn Street. It's a law office now, taken again in the winter. And then of course many people would remember Dr. Reinard, and he lived from 1897 to 1980. And he was a doctor in Brecon, but he came to the hospital and operated, and was quite a character, I gather. John Diefenbaker and he were good friends, and in fact they did a world trip together back in 1958. Reinhardt was an MP in the Diefenbaker government, and he would often he took care of Diefenbaker. I think he was the personal physician for John Diefenbaker, as well as being a doctor here, so he was a very busy man. That's the Reinhardt Clinic on the left, and then on the right we have the mental health clinic that was run by Dr. Nancy Armbrust in the 1960s. And then this, which is now Carson Funeral Home, was the office of Dr. Woodward. And then finally we see 16 O'Brien Street. Unfortunately, I don't have a photo of the nursing residence then. Here's a few well-known personalities from the, I guess, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And we have Bill Hume, who was the CEO for many years. And then moving clockwise, Bob Kehoe became the CEO after that for many, many years. And then Berna Jones, who I think ran the place in many ways. She was a nurse and head of nursing, and I think was involved in administration. And then, of course, Maureen Harris, who was head of nursing as well after that. And then we see just a shot here of Berna Jones with Leslie Frost, who was a native of Orillia, and he became the Premier of Ontario. And this shot was taken in 1969. And then you can see a number of people looking at a new piece of equipment that the Ladies Auxiliary had donated. There's a few people that worked in the laboratory. That's Jack Philpott, who was there for many years. And some nurses hard at work on the Harvey ward. There's a SMH nursing student party in the 1960s. And then the Queen visited in 1959, and she came and she planted a bunch of maple trees in town. And there is some controversy as to whether she planted this tree, which is in the quadrangle. If you go into the current cafeteria and you look out the big glass window, you can see that there's a large maple tree in the quadrangle. And that, they say, was planted by Queen Elizabeth, but there's some controversy about that in 1959. That's Glenn Penwarden, who was the CEO. I think he was one of the a very good COO that we had for many years. That's Dave Hempstead, pharmacist for many, many years in the hospital. There's the switchboard of the hospital and the old soldiers. This is Dave Freeman, pharmacist. He still works in the pharmacy. He's close to 80 years old now, but he still does help out in the pharmacy. There's Dr. Ron Taylor, who was the first orthopedic surgeon in Orillia, worked here for a good 30 years or more. And he's been retired about maybe 4 or 5 years now. Dr. Dick Johnson, who many of you will know. This is a picture of him in 2003. And there's Dr. John Strathern with Bernard Jones demonstrating state-of-the-art equipment back in the 1960s. And there's a number of docs, all of whom I know personally. On the left is Dr. Sachanowski. Moving from left to right, we have Dr. Sachanowski, Dr. Harrison, Dr. John Dawson, Dr. Bob Hall, Dr. John Toy, Dr. Marty Libling, and Dr. Don Nixon. And I would say half of them have mustaches and the other don't, so it was in style in those days. More fundraising. Dialysis became a very central part of the hospital in the 1990s. You can see Sandy Johnson with Marilyn Berger, who was the head of nursing for many years. And then this is a little more recently, Liz Riley, 2013, and a number of the board members accepting a check for $100,000. Not sure who, it was from the TD Bank Group. And so that's my presentation. A few conclusions. Orillia proudly supports their hospital, always have and always will. It has a giving spirit, and hospital building is in its blood or in its DNA. Its DNA is to keep that hospital moving along and progressing. Hospital development is an ongoing, constant process. It's quality improvement, and it never really stops, despite many years that might go on between phases. The hospital is kept up very well with the times, and I'm very proud to have been a part of it. And I should also say that a river runs through it, which is a good thing. Thank you very much.